last week we looked at the legislative branch. Today we're going to zoom in on the executive branch. Now it's an interesting moment to do so. And again, as always, my goal is not to talk politics, but really to look at um, civics and government. What is the design of our government coming out of the Constitution itself, and kind of look at things historically and from a civics and government side of things. The way our government is meant to work isn't always how it does work in real life, and there's reasons for that. Um, but we're going to look at how the Constitution today lays out the presidency, and as you can see, oh, I didn't show my screen yet. Um, the as the title of this article says, the evolution of the presidency. So the Constitution gives us one thing, gives us a blueprint as they designed it 200 years ago, and then that changes over time. In real life, the powers and duties and expectations of the presidency, just like Congress, just like the courts, it evolves over time, and so we're going to look at that. But I thought we could, as historical students and as people, most of you guys are preparing for the GED, you got to be comfortable with those original documents, those primary sources. So I'm going to click on this link, and if at any time, if you send me an email, let me put it in the chat. I can never type and talk at the same time. There's my email in the chat. If you send me an email, if you want to do it right now, or if you want to do it right after class, send me an email. I will send you this document so you can check all this stuff out. But let's look at the Constitution itself. So this is constitutioncenter.org. Certainly not political in any way. And this is Article 2. So we looked at Article 1. Actually, we didn't look at last week. We didn't do this, but the legislative branch is in Article 1, and so the executive branch is in Article 2, just like sections of the Constitution. So Article 2 is the executive branch, and it gives us a note. This was signed in convention on September 17th, 1870 or 1787, ratified in 1788. Portions of Article 2, Section 1 were changed by the 12th Amendment and the 25th Amendment. So this just gives you a heads up. And so you see, what I want you to see is this primary source, the Constitution of the United States, is not something to be afraid of. If you sit down and you're taking the GED or the high set exam, and you have a reading that says it's, Section 1, Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, it's not something you can't read. You may have to stretch yourself and say, hey, okay, what do I know about the presidency? What do I know about the government? And you need a kind of a framework to plug it into for it to make sense. But this isn't stuff that we can't understand as just regular people. And so it is a little bit long. It says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. He shall hold his term shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with a vice president chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. And then it describes very kind of vaguely, in general terms, how the process works. And as we get through the summer and into the fall, at some point, if you're still studying with the distance learning project, I will be talking about the electoral college system, or maybe actually next week, the first primary state, the state primaries are going to start. So maybe at some point we can talk about that system, how that works, because that's a little bit different than the Constitution lays out. but it's good for us to know as people vote. So Section 1 is all about how the president is elected, is chosen. And it gives very specifically the oath of office. The president says, and every president has always said, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That was written by the founding fathers, as we call them, as they wrote the Constitution in 1787. They were making a plan, and they included that detail. I think it must have been important to them. And every paragraph here represents a lot of debating and conversation and back and forth as those people wrote the Constitution. Section 2, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. He shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, always talking about checks and balances, balancing of power, to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Concur means to agree. And he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. So we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. So that's some of the powers and duties of the presidency, Section 2. Section 3, he shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union, from which we get the State of the Union address, which President Trump's going to deliver in a week or two here, early February. I forget the date exactly. That comes from the Constitution. That the design there is just that the president reports back the State of the Union, the state of things, how things are in the country. The implication there is, the meaning there is, he's accountable to Congress. He has to come back to Congress. The president has to come back to Congress and report how things are going. A little bit different now than it was in the 1700s. That it serves a bit of a different purpose, but it's there in the Constitution. And Section 4, and this is in the news very much, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. As I'm sure you're aware, President Trump has been impeached and is now impeached by the House of Representatives, as we've touched on, and is now currently, today, there's a chance it even wraps up by tomorrow, or might go into the future. But currently, as we speak, he is on trial. Those impeachment charges are on trial in the United States Senate. So that's the Constitution being acted out. Okay, so that's four sections, a couple of which are pretty short, of Article 2 of the Constitution. That's the executive branch. That's the presidency. Okay, it's a little bit long, but it's not as long as you might think it would be, considering all the details and how important it is to be president. How complicated that is. So, what do you guys think? Has anybody ever sat down and read the Constitution before?
Not really. I got an example of Constitution when I got my citizenship passport, but I never read it.
Oh, Nadia. So when you became a citizen, did they give you like a small, what they call the pocket Constitution?
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's neat.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, I mean, it is very readable. especially if you have a little bit of background knowledge and you already know some of these things, it's not very hard to understand. Sometimes, like if you read the Declaration of Independence, which was when the colonists declared their independence from Britain. This is before the Constitution was written. In 1776, July 4th, 1776, they signed the Declaration of Independence. If you read that, it is a little bit harder to read. It's the language is more flowery, a little bit more showy. That can be hard to read. The Constitution isn't meant to be fancy. It's not meant to be impressive. It's just describing the government. They designed a government, or they needed their job as they gathered in 1787 was to design a new government for this new country. And so it's not very fancy. It's pretty easy to understand. So if it's here's a link, constitutioncenter.org. You can Google the Constitution, and as long as it's a fairly trustworthy website, you can read the Constitution in a million different places, and it's pretty readable. Now, every sentence in the Constitution over the last 200 years has become, well, just take for instance the Section 4 about impeachment. You could read a million different articles about what that means and when it's okay, and if you watch the news last night, they're arguing what is impeachable and what's not impeachable and why it's okay and why it's not okay. So everybody's going to have an opinion and a different interpretation, but the basics of the Constitution are pretty easy to understand. So if you sit down to take the GED test and it says this reading selection is from Article 2 of the Constitution, it's nothing to be afraid of. And hopefully, what we'll talk about today in the next hour is, hopefully with a little bit of knowledge, it's definitely understandable. Okay. So, let's read this article. This is from, as we've done before, ushistory.org. It's an online textbook. As much as I can tell, this textbook was written in the early 2000s. Some of the references are to President Bill Clinton. So, President Bill Clinton, President Bush, this isn't exactly an up-to-date information. Some, even today, I think there's a couple of references that are a little bit old, but it's good information, and it's an online textbook that I like to use. So let's preview it. Anytime you read an article, it's good to preview stuff. So we've got an introduction, and we've got a couple of headings. Constitutional qualifications and powers. We'll look at that. There's some bullet points. These are things. The Constitution assigned the following powers to the president. So these are constitutional powers. They're given to the president, to the executive branch. These are explicitly given, details given in the Constitution. There's a couple. And then that's pretty much it. And then we can look at the presidential order of succession. We'll look at that. And it's a list of people. If the president were to leave office, die in office, be removed from office, who then becomes president? And we can look at that. So we can take turns here, and it's actually not super long, and we can talk about a couple of things. So this is the executive branch. The job of the executive branch is to execute the laws, which means to put them into practice, make them real, put them to do the things the laws say. The legislative branch writes the laws, hopefully representing us, the citizens, the people. The executive branch doesn't make laws, although because of the checks and balances, the president and the executive branch is involved in making laws. But the executive branch's job is to execute the laws. It's the executive branch. So they execute the laws. They live out the laws. They make them actual. They make them real in society. So I'll read the introduction, and then we can take turns going here. It says the 21st century dawned on a very different presidency than the one created at the end of the 1700s. Constitutional provisions limited the early presidency, although the personalities of the first three, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, shaped it into a more influential position by the early 1800s. However, throughout the 1800s until the 1930s, Congress was the dominant branch of the national government. Then, throughout the rest of the 20th century, the balance of power shifted dramatically so that the executive branch currently has at least equal power to the legislative branch. How did this shift happen? Anytime you're reading something and there's a question, I love it when there's a question in a reading, because then I know that that's the question that's going to be answered. That the rest of this reading is probably going to answer that question. So when I'm doing a reading and there's, especially at the end of an introduction, there's a question, I know that's great. That's what this is all about. As a reader, I know I love to see a question that's then going to be answered for me. It makes my job easier of understanding what to read. I can expect. I know what to expect here. Okay. Okay. Constitutional qualifications and powers. Amy Lynn, you're at the top of the list on my screen. Do you have a microphone you can read? Amy Lynn, do you have a microphone? Okay. All right. If you've got some noise, if you don't want to read, that's fine today. No problem. Cynthia, do you have a microphone?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Cynthia, why don't you read the next paragraph, Article 2 of the Constitution.
Article 2 of the Constitution defines the qualifications, benefits, and powers of the presidency. The president must be at least 35 years old and must have resided in the United States for no fewer than 14 years. Presidents must be natural-born citizens. The Constitution states that the president should be paid a compensation that cannot be increased or decreased during a term. Congress determines the salary, which increased in 2001 to $400,000, doubling the salary that was set back in the 1960s.
Okay, good. So those are all details made by the Constitution. And it's interesting if you think as a historian, you always got to be thinking, okay, why did they make that decision? And I think, a couple of weeks ago when we were talking generally about the three branches of government, I think we did touch on these ideas. Why would they say you have to be at least 35 years old? Now, this is in the 1700s. Why did they say you must be at least 35 years old?
To be wise enough and to make sure the president got his education already.
Yeah. Hopefully
That's good.
Hopefully they have a good education. Amy Lynn says maturity.
Experience.
Yeah, some life experience, hopefully experience in the government, relevant experience, maybe, working with world leaders or whatnot. Say what you will about 20-year-olds, but I don't know that the average 20-year-old or perhaps any 20-year-old is ready to be president of the United States. So we give them a little bit more time to gain experience, to gain skills, knowledge, understanding, hopefully, yes, maturity and wisdom. So I think that's interesting. You can be a senator, I think, at age 25, and House of Representatives, I'm not sure if there is maybe there's not a, maybe it's 25, or maybe there's not a limit. Um, but yeah, that's an interesting detail they tossed in there. Um, and must have resided in the United States for no fewer than 14 years. They want to make sure that you have knowledge. Okay, there's kind of two reasons for that. One, and you got to think, okay, this is the 1700s. They just broke away from Britain. Okay, think of what their lives were like and what their world was like. And this is their plan for the future. They're hoping, I'm sure, that America lasts forever. And so they're planning, as they design this government, they're planning for the future and trying to anticipate problems. So they say you have to live in the United States for no fewer, you have to have lived here for at least 14 years. So one, to be a president, you have to, of the United States, you have to know about the United States. Um, but also at the time, think historically, you got a lot of these leaders living in other countries, or perhaps, um, well, president has to be a natural born citizen, so you can't gain citizenship later in life and become president. So Nadia, I'm sorry, but you just won't have the opportunity to run for president of the United States. Um, and they made that decision. They want people, uh, not so much even now, but then certainly, who are going to be absolutely loyal to the United States. And again, not so much today, but back then, when just a few years before, they were fighting a war to break away from Britain. The worst thing you could do is have somebody become elected to head the United States government who has ideas about, well, maybe we should go back to Britain. That would be a disaster from their perspective. So they're creating a system that protects, above all, protects the government, protects the United States, the best interests of the United States. And so they need somebody who's mature, who's wise, and who knows about America and is going to be loyal to America.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Um, they give they make sure that this is a paid position, although President Trump and people in the past have refused. I forget, there's a president, maybe Kennedy, just refused the payment. I think I could be wrong. And then President Trump's not the first president to donate his salary. Um, but they made sure on purpose that it is a paid position. Um, you're not going to become mega rich off of 400. I think today it's 450,000 maybe. I'd take that paycheck, but then again, it's a heck of a hard job. So there's probably easier ways. I don't know, but there's probably easier ways to make $450,000 than becoming president of the United States. So you're not going to become mega rich off of that, but it's. I think you're well compensated for your time. So those things come from the Constitution. There were decisions that were historically made back in 1787 when they were writing it. They did all these things on purpose, and there's all kinds of historical research and things about why they made this decision or that decision. I think there were people who said this should be a voluntary job. We don't want people who are going to do this just for the money. But then, other people said, well, no, we don't want people, certainly we don't want people who are just going to take this job just for the money, but that seems unlikely. But we don't want people who get no money, because then they could be easily bribed from other sources. So there's there are two sides to every debate. Okay, Jennifer, do you want to read? How many do we got here? We got 4. Jennifer, why don't you read military power if you could?
Okay, military power. The founders saw the importance of a strong military to protect the country and its citizens, but they named the president a civilian. Wait, hold on, I lost it here. A civilian, the commander in chief of the armed services. They were ever mindful of checking and balancing power, and they did not want a military. Wait, I lost my place here.
Oh, that's okay.
Military general to seize the government.
Okay, thank you. So, there have been plenty of presidents who have military experience. After World War II, we elected Eisenhower, who was a general in the army during World War II, if I'm not mistaken. So we have entrusted this job. We've chosen to entrust this job to military people before, but and I'm not totally clear on how this works. But as far as I know, the president is not a military general. I mean, you do not see in the United States. You will never see the president in a military uniform. Whereas in other countries, you do see that. And they put all kinds of medals on their chest and badges and the hats and the golden, the ropes on their shoulders. And they're very proud that they are the head of the army. In the United States, the way it's designed in the Constitution, the military, the top of the military, the commander in chief, is not part of the military. He is a civilian. Even if we elect somebody who's from the military, who has military experience, as president, you don't see that person in a military uniform. And again, that they wrote that in the Constitution on purpose. They want the army to be run by a civilian who hopefully has when he makes decisions, he's not thinking of, or certainly he's concerned about winning wars and things, but he's also concerned about the civilian side of things. How is this going to affect the American people, families, the economy, the whole picture? So that's they did make the president the commander in chief of the army, the military, but he's a civilian commander in chief, and that's a little bit different, but it's something that makes America a little bit unique. Okay. Carla, could you read diplomatic power, that bullet point?
Sure. Diplomatic power. The president was given the power to make treaties with foreign nations, but not without the advice and consent of the Senate. Two-thirds of the senators must agree to a treaty the president signs, and if they do not, the treaty is not valid. The Constitution also provides that the president shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers, which includes the duty of recognizing new nations, representing the United States to other countries, and performing related ceremonial duties.
Okay, thank you. So as if you've watched a little bit of the news over the last 3 years with President Trump and before that President Obama, when he goes overseas, it's a big deal. He goes and he visits other world leaders. I think 2 times now. I think President Trump has visited the Queen of England. Now that's a very different situation. The Queen doesn't really run their government. It's the prime minister and parliament and stuff. But she's kind of what you call the figurehead, kind of part of their government, at least ceremonially. So you see him shaking hands and bowing and being very nice and being very diplomatic to the Queen of England and other world leaders. They receive him. then sometimes they come to the United States. He receives them. They have a special dinner. They do all kinds of. They exchange ceremonial gifts from each other's countries. It's a way to build friendships with other countries, and hopefully those friendships benefit us, making economic friendships or military alliances. It's a way to build friendships. And do you remember, I think it was it 2000, summer of 2018, so like a year and a half ago, President Trump was the first sitting actual president at the time. What country did he visit that was a very big deal that he was the first president to visit that country? Anybody remember that one?
Is it North Korea?
North Korea. That was a big deal. Now, North Korea, I don't know all the details. But North Korea has been a country since, I think, the 1950s or even before that. I'm not sure. But no current president has ever visited North Korea. The moment you do, and he did, and when he did, he was the first president to do so. And people liked it or didn't like it because it recognizes that country as a real country. It's sending the signal to North Korea that, hey, we are equals, North Korea and the United States. You can receive the United States as president, you can have a special dinner, you can shake hands, you can take pictures, and we sit and talk as equals. No other president before has wanted to send that signal. Because of the way North Korea is, it's not a democracy. The people aren't well treated. It's a dangerous, and most people say it's a dangerous and bad country. Not the people, but the government, how it's run. And no president has ever wanted to give them that power of shaking hands with the United States as president. But that is one of the powers when you are president. And so Trump did that. I don't think because he loved North Korea, but I think he did that as a part of a negotiation. He said, okay, if I can give them this meeting, I'm guessing this is what he thinks. If I can go there and shake their hands and they can take pictures and they can feel like a big successful country, then maybe they won't be so angry and fearful, and maybe we can have better discussions about peace and nuclear missiles and things like that. So he did that for North Korea, hoping to get something else in return. He gave them that gift of a visit from the U.S. president, hoping that they would then give him something in return. That's the diplomatic power of the presidency. Everybody on earth, virtually, not really everybody, most countries on earth would love to have a good, friendly relationship with the United States of America. And so that's as kind of the face of America, that's one thing that the president can do. But there are checks and balances with the Senate, particularly the Senate as the one of the two houses of government or houses of Congress. He can sign treaties, but 2/3 of the Senate has to agree to it. He can. Part of that is it says he shall receive ambassadors from other countries, but he also appoints ambassadors to other countries who are representatives of the United States in that particular country. He appoints those people, but then the Senate has to approve them. So the president can do some things, but always with the Senate kind of holding a leash a little bit, holding him back, or making sure that what he's doing is agreed upon by the Senate. So it's those checks and balances, the balance of power. Any questions about those two things we've talked about, military power, diplomatic power?
No.
No.
Okay. Nadia, could you read appointment power?
Yes. Appointment power. The Constitution gives the President the responsibility to appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. Again, the Senate gives its advice and consent, so that all appointments must be confirmed by a majority of the senators voting.
Okay, thank you. So, like I just said, so there's certain jobs in the government that he is supposed to fill. Ambassadors to other countries, public ministers. When there's an empty seat on the Supreme Court, it's the president's job to appoint somebody, to nominate. And there's a whole list there's literally thousands of other jobs that the president puts somebody in. But it's the Senate's job to approve of those people. And sometimes, depending on the job, it's a simple majority of just, 50, 51%, or sometimes it's a 2/3, what they call a supermajority, 2/3 majority, which is more people. That means it's harder to get that agreement on. But again, balance of power, checks and balances between the different branches of government. Tolulope, could you read the last part, legislative power?
Yes, I can. Legislative power. The president was given the power to veto legislation. Every bill that passes both houses of Congress must be submitted to the president, although Congress can get around the president in several ways. If the president fails to sign the bill within 10 days, it becomes law anyway. Also, Congress may override a presidential veto by a vote of 2/3 of each house.
Okay, so this should be a big part of the president's job, although the way that the government works, Congress works, they don't pass as many laws as maybe they should, because there's so much disagreement between the two major parties, the Republicans and Democrats. They really, and in my opinion, they hate to work together these days, and so nothing gets done. Each party, I think, is so afraid to give the other side a victory that they don't really want to pass any laws. So not many laws get to the president's desk, but when a law gets passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate, then it goes to the president. The president then can sign it. If it's a good law, he knows everybody's in agreement. He agrees with it. The American people love it. He signs it, and it becomes a law. If for whatever reason he doesn't want it to become law, either he disagrees with it entirely, or maybe he disagrees with just a little part of it, he can veto it, which means he refuses to sign it, and then it goes back to Congress. Now, as you said, it says also Congress may override a presidential veto by a vote of 2/3 of each house. If the president vetoes it, he refuses it to sign it to become law, it then goes back to Congress, the two houses of Congress. They can vote again, and if 2/3 say, hey, we still want this to be law, 2/3 of us feel very strongly that this should be law, then it can become law over top of the presidential veto. The hope there is that 2/3 of the 435 House of Representatives people, or 2/3 of the 100 senators, are representing what their people back home that they represent, that elected them, want. And so if 2/3 of the country think this law is a good idea, then hopefully it will become law, even if the president vetoes it. So that's legislative power. Again, doesn't happen as much as we all wish it would, because there used to be much more compromise, or certainly when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, there were not these two political parties. In fact, they didn't at that time, 1787, they wrote the Constitution. They didn't have political parties as in the same way that we have political parties today. It was much more based on opinions and, well, maybe you think this about topic A, but I think the opposite. But maybe on topic B, you and I agree. And topic C, I disagree with you, but I agree with this person over here. So the groups were much more malleable. They moved around more, much more fluid. Today we have Republicans and Democrats. And if you're a Republican, you agree with all of this. And if you're a Democrat, you agree with all of that. There's not very much overlap. When they wrote the Constitution, it wasn't like that. It was much more compromise. Well, maybe you and I agree on this, but disagree on that. And so you could always have a group of people who agree on this, but not that. And you can always get laws passed. Anyway, so when they designed the government, they didn't know that here in 2020 we would have very strong, very concrete parties, Republicans and Democrats. And so we're working under a system in the Constitution that wasn't really, we've sort of broken the rules, or they didn't write it for they didn't write the Constitution for these particular rules with these two very concrete, very, in my opinion, stubborn political parties. So it's, thinking historically, it's a little bit, I think it's kind of interesting to view it how, when you read the Constitution, you got to view it, how did they intend for this to work? And I think that's what we try to do in these readings here. Okay, another thing, any questions on those two things, appointment power, legislative power? Any questions at all?
No.
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, you can always ask me questions. So another thing that's interesting is the Presidential Order of Succession. It wasn't until the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 that they said, hey, what would happen if the president died? Now, there had been, even before 1947, there had been a couple of presidents who died in office. Now, even then, even before this law of 1947, if the president dies in office, we've had somebody die of kind of natural causes. We've had a couple of presidents be assassinated, shot, killed in office. Who then becomes president?
The vice president.
The vice president. Okay, so that's happened a number of times. In 1972, I think, 73, maybe 73, when Richard Nixon was going to be impeached, but he was not impeached, as we've touched on before. He saw that he was definitely going to be impeached, and he saw that he was definitely going to be removed from office. He said, I don't want to be the president who gets removed from office. So he resigned on his own. So the next day, he said, effective at noon tomorrow. The next day, he resigned from office. And at that moment, at noon that day, he got on a helicopter at the White House and flew away. And Gerald Ford, the vice president, was immediately said that oath of office that is in the Constitution that we looked at. He was sworn in as President of the United States. So that's happened before. You also have a couple of presidents who've been shot. Who's been assassinated while president?
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln.
And Kennedy.
Abraham Lincoln at
Kennedy.
the end of the Civil War, 1865, and then John F. Kennedy.
John Kennedy.
Yeah, 19 was that? I don't know when that was. 66, 63. Yeah, they were shot and died while president. They immediately, and if you ever, there's all kinds of stuff out there for Kennedy especially, and there's conspiracy theories about who shot him and stuff like that. But it's interesting to look at historically. They immediately, upon learning that President Kennedy was dead, his heart had stopped, he is dead. They immediately, no matter where the president was, Lyndon Johnson, no matter where the vice president was, they immediately got a judge to swear him in as president. Because you can't have, you don't want a minute to go by without there being a president of the United States, right? So you immediately swear in that vice president. Now, 1947, this is after World War II, in the early 1940s. You have President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He served for more than two terms. He served for 3 terms and then was re-elected for a 4th term. He was going to be, he had been president for 12 years and then died shortly into his 4th term of office. At that time, they said, okay, we need a plan here. Because what would happen if a disaster struck, the president dies, the vice president becomes president? What happens then? And so they made what you see on the screen now, the presidential line of succession. They have a plan down to 18 people of who becomes president. I don't know why this line for Elaine Chao, for Secretary of Transportation, I don't know why she's not listed or her number's gone. But so you have, these are all people that are in the president's cabinet, his immediate advisors or leaders of departments within the executive branch. Except for number 2, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So has anybody on Netflix, if you have Netflix, there's a show called Designated Survivor. Has anybody seen that show? Or seen, if you log into Netflix, have you seen that icon for the show Designated Survivor?
No,
I have not, but I am definitely going to look for it.
It's a really good show. And the first season, I think there's like 3 seasons. The first season is a little bit more interesting. I've been watching it. It's in the first episode, not to spoil it for you, but in the first scene of the first episode, it's during the State of the Union address. Now, when the president gives the State of the Union address every year, every January, and President Trump is going to give the State of the Union address in a week or 2 here. It's the president. The vice president comes. Both houses of Congress are all gathered. The Supreme Court is sitting there. Those 9 Supreme Court justices are sitting in the front row. And it's like literally they gather the entire government in I think they do it in the House of Representatives chamber because it's the biggest room. It's the whole government. All 3 branches of government are gathered there. Now, I think this is a real thing. And so in the show, they have one guy called the Designated Survivor. And in the show, it's the secretary. I think he's the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. If you look on this list, this is the real list, I copied it from the internet today. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is 13th in line for the president. And I believe this is a real thing. During the State of the Union address, when the entire government is gathered in one room, they take one person from the government, in this case, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and they put him in a safe place in a hotel room somewhere in Washington, D.C. They protect him with Secret Service, and he is the designated survivor. So in this show, Designated Survivor, it's really interesting. There's a bomb, and it blows up the Capitol building. And it's actually like really moving to see. So the president, vice president, Supreme Court, all the houses, all the senators, all the House of representatives, all die in this terrorist attack. And so this one guy, who's played by the actor Kiefer Sutherland, and he's really, really good, I think, he becomes president. And yet the entire government has died in this terrorist attack. Except then they find there's one senator and one representative who lived. So it's these three people. And then, of course, so the show is really interesting. He then is president. He didn't ask to be president. He's not particularly qualified to be a good president, except, in the show, he's a really good guy. He's really honest. He's compassionate. And so he ends up being a wonderful president, obviously. But he has to rebuild a country. They have to have elections for every Senate position and every representative in Washington, D.C. And it's an interesting show. And it's based on the Constitution that there is a presidential line of succession. And so he's 13th in line, and yet he's the designated survivor. And there just happens to be this big, terrible terrorist bombing of the Capitol building during the State of the Union address, while the whole three branches of government are sitting in one room. Bombs go off and the whole Capitol building gets blown up, and it's scary. It's really scary. But anyway, yeah, on Netflix, Designated Survivor. If you have an hour, the first one or two episodes are really interesting because it's something that, as opposed to like aliens or zombies, it's kind of a horror movie that could really, really happen if the worst possible terrorist attack took place. I thought it was really interesting. I thought I'd share it with you. Maybe in the future we could talk. I think next week we'll talk about the judicial branch, so we'll finish our discussion of the three branches of government. Maybe in the future we could have a discussion of a little bit more about the executive branch, because we have all these people listed here. Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General. All of these things, the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, these are all departments within the executive branch. The executive branch isn't just the president sitting alone. He's kind of at the top of a pyramid of a vast thousands of people that work in departments of the executive branch. So maybe in the future we could look at a little bit about that, how the executive branch works. Okay, so we did a reading. If you send me an email, again, my email's in the chat. I will send this back to you. I'll have the recording up today or tomorrow. I'll share the recording. I'll share this document here. You can read it over. You can take a closer look at the Constitution. But hopefully, we see the Constitution is very readable. It doesn't give you all the details that you need to know if you were going to build our government back up from scratch, as they did in the show. But the Constitution is pretty easy to understand, especially if you have a little bit of background knowledge, which hopefully now we do. So any questions at all? Anything to discuss? No? Okay.
I can't think of anything right now.
Okay. All right. Well, super. Well, good luck in all the rest of your studies this week in distance learning. You guys are all coming from different places, and I just do this. I used to do distance learning and help with classes and help with students. Now I do other stuff, and this is all I do really with students. So, good luck studying, and of course, be in touch with your teacher if you need anything. But yeah, I hope you can log in next Thursday, and we'll keep talking about stuff.
Thank you
you.
so
Thank
much.
you. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for logging in. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.
Thank you.